The Lifestyle Show, presented by Selena Mackenzie.
The book is called The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, How an Intrepid Band of French Women Resisted the Nazis in Hitler's all-female concentration camp. Welcome to the show, author Lynne Olson.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
So, whereabouts was Ravensbrück?
Ravensbrück was about 50 miles north of Berlin. It was the only all-female Nazi concentration camp during World War II.
And yeah, it was the only female concentration camp. So how did you discover about this story? I mean, it seems to have been forgotten in history.
It really has. I mean, I think most people know what they know about the German concentration camps. It's really the all-male camps like Dachau and Buchenwald, which were the reason we know about them is they were liberated by American and British troops, and those troops were actually being covered by journalists, American and British journalists, who were with those troops when they liberated those camps. And so all the photos that we have seen and all the film footage that we have seen about those camps, the stacks of dead bodies and skeleton-like survivors, they came from those journalists. Ravensbrück was in the Soviet zone. It was liberated by Soviet troops, and there were no Western journalists with them when they liberated the camp. And it remained in the Soviet zone after the war. So it basically was forgotten because nobody was reporting it at the time or afterwards. So what happened at Ravensbrück is really been lost in history, as well as the women who actually were inmates there.
So the camp had over 130,000 women from all over occupied Europe, but it was a labour camp. It wasn't an extermination camp like Auschwitz.
That's correct. An extermination camp like the death camps in Poland, I mean, they were designed to quickly kill. Most of the prisoners who were sent there were murdered almost immediately after they arrived. Ravensbrück, like most of the concentration camps, was a labor camp, which didn't mean that it wasn't a death camp. It was just a slower death. I mean, these camps, Ravensbrück, the purpose of Ravensbrück was to provide slave labor to German war factories near Ravensbrück and throughout Germany. So they provided labor. These women, this was a horrific job. These women were treated horrifically. They were beaten. They had very little food. They were exhausted, and they didn't last very long for the most part. I think the average really lifespan for many of these women was just a few months. Sometimes it extended into a year or more. But once they were too exhausted and too sick to work, they were killed. So, it was really kind of a slow death camp. It wasn't really an extermination camp, but the result was the same. Yeah. I mean, the Germans didn't expect anybody to survive the war.
Yeah, I think once the war, am I right in thinking once the war was over, they tried to get rid of them all anyway? Because didn't they do experiments on some of the Polish women?
Yes, they did. The Polish women were the largest group, but most of these women had been members of resistance groups in their countries, and that's why they were there. And the Poles had by far the largest group. And in the middle of the war, German doctors, Nazi doctors, conducted a series of awful, really bestial experiments on these young Polish women, and basically operated on their legs and butchered them. I mean, many died, and most of them were crippled for the rest of their lives. But that's a really interesting story because the Poles refused to act like victims, which is true of many of the women in that camp. And I focus on French women, but that was true of the Poles and others. And that's really the story. It's not just a story of the awful things that happened to these women, but it's a story of how they managed to rise above it, how they managed to survive by banding together, in a sisterhood and helping each other live. And then they actually resisted the Germans in the camp. And that's the takeaway from this book.
Yeah.
despite all this awful stuff, you can survive and you can actually do good things.
Yes, it seems like there was a lot of camaraderie there.
Huge amount of camaraderie. And the women realized that was the only way they were going to survive. That they had to take care of each other. They had to watch out for each other. By themselves, they were helpless. They were a victim, but they refused to allow themselves to be treated like victims. And the only way they could do that was to come together.
And you talk about individual women, Lynne, or is it just the sisterhood as a whole?
I focus, I talk about the sisterhood as a whole, but I focus in the book on 4 women in particular, 4 French women. They were leaders in this group, and they're really, really interesting. And so I followed them not just in the camp. I begin with their childhood. I followed them through their lives, especially how they got involved in resistance activities in France, and then followed them to Ravensbrück. And afterwards, all 4 of them survived, and all 4 contributed a great deal to their countries and to the world afterwards. So it's, again, for me, it's a book of of hope and courage.
And did all 4 contribute to the book, or had they all sadly passed away when you started writing it?
Unfortunately, they all had died, although all 4 of them lived to be old women. One of them, Germaine Tillion, who is really the major figure in the book, lived to be 100.
Wow.
Yeah, it's incredible. But yes, they all have died. But they all wrote memoirs. And what's the most incredible thing is that they gave hours of interviews to a young American documentary filmmaker, and those interviews were a tremendous source for me, because they really talked about their lives and what it was like, and how they depended on each other, and how important the 4 of them were to each other.
And did you manage to interview any of the relatives?
Yes, I interviewed several relatives, granddaughters, daughters. I interviewed a number of people who actually knew them. I mean, it was good because, as I said, they lived to be very old. In fact, the last one only died about 5 years ago. So there are plenty of people around who knew them. So I got a very good sense of of the remarkable women they were.
Yeah. I'm glad when people like you write books like this, and I've done quite a few interviews they're like unsung heroes, people that should be in the history books, but they're not until now.
That's right. Actually, that's who I look for when I write a book. I am a historian. I write mostly about World War II, but I always look for people who really haven't got the credit they deserve. And that's really, really true of these women.
And although I know the book is about the sisterhood and the camaraderie, was it difficult to write? Because going through, some of these awful experiments that they did on these Polish women, was it quite difficult to write and research?
That's a really good question. And yes, the answer is yes. It was that part of the book was extremely emotionally difficult for me. And, in doing the research and finding out what these women had to go through. And it was hard to write. And I was really glad, when I finished that part, and then could go on to what happened after the war and how they really managed to triumph and they never got over what had happened to them, but they managed to create a life for themselves and for others. And basically that was their revenge against the Nazis. Most of them got married, they had kids. And so they managed to triumph over what had happened. And that was the really good part of writing this.
Yeah. Incredible.
As you say, dealing day by day. I mean, and I'm doing it from like 80 years in the future, but to have to read what these women went through, it was really tough.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. And I really want to get their names out there. You mentioned Germaine Tillion.
Yeah.
Tillion. What are the other 3? Who are the other 3 ladies?
The other 3 are Geneviève de Gaulle, who was the niece of Charles de Gaulle. And the 2 others were Jacqueline Dalencourt, who was a countess, and Aileen
Gerard?
Yes, Anise Gerard. Thank you so much. Anise Gerard. Yeah.
It's easy when it's in front of you.
Yeah. It was in many ways one of the most interesting of them. She was a college student. These were young women. Germaine Tillion was in her 30s. These women were in their teens and 20s when they went there. So, it's just extraordinary. And Anise was particularly, headstrong, independent, not going to take anything from anybody. And so they were incredibly feisty, brave young women. And, they're really my heroes.
Yes, I can understand that. And I know you've written many other books. Did you say they're all on war history?
With one exception. They all have been about World War II. Early on, I wrote mostly about the UK, actually, in World War II. And then the last 3 books have been about France, focusing on women in France, the unsung heroines that you referred to.
Yeah.
Women in resistance movements, particularly in France, have never gotten the credit they deserve. That's starting to change, but the men basically took the story right after the war and insisted they were the only ones responsible for the resistance, not women. And
yes.
Women were the lifeblood of the resistance. And it's just in the last 15, 20 years that women are finally starting to be treated as the people that they were.
Yeah. The importance of the women's participation was definitely underplayed, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
Well, we're selling the book right now on our website for our listeners to buy. It's called The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, How an Intrepid Band of French Women Resisted the Nazis in Hitler's all-female concentration camp. It's by Lynne Olson, who we're chatting to now. And if people want to find out about you and your other books, Lynne, do you have a website as well?
I do. It's www.lynneolson.com.
Okay, just stay on the line. I'm just going to go to an advert break so I can speak to you off air. But thanks very much for joining us.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.